All right, teammates. We are back once again. If this is your first time listening to the Move Swiftly podcast, welcome to the show, the number one show on innovative teamwork. Great to have you. To my regular listeners, here we go again, baby. You already know how we get down here. We bring you nothing but the best. And by the end of the episode, the main thing, the main takeaway from everything I do here, everything that I look to build, whether it's myself as a solo episode or bringing somebody on, is helping you guys understand you are not alone, understanding whatever struggles you may be going through or whatever things, whatever challenges are coming up in your day to day. This show is here to provide some sort of a kind of a virtual teammate for you to get through the next day. So I have a Mr. Rob Giardinelli here, founder of Event Mindset. All right, let me do this because I've been listening to you all day, Rob. But founder of Event Mindset, but describes himself as an introvert. So there's a lot of things that we got to take away. A lot. I mean, in such a timely discussion, seeing that I'm recording this 2 weeks away from going to a first ever event named the Creators Fest, and I took a ton out of there, and a lot of things you were saying were resonating with me. So before I make the intro too long, Rob, welcome to the show. How are you?
Aswan, I'm thrilled to be here and I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, and then thank you for being on because not only thank you for being on, but thank you for the work you do because like a lot like I was listening to, like I was saying in the intro, when you're an introvert, and many times it's hard for people to really look at themselves as a great communicator or think that the skill of communication is something that they need to learn. And you're able to kind of debunk that myth with your work. And it's interesting because you started off in the tech space. And, whenever you tell somebody you're working in tech, oh, that's the guy behind the computer, just not doing anything, never speaking to anyone. But, you're able to build from that. So talk a little bit about your background, how you kind of grew up and stuff like that. And we'll kind of go from there, man.
Absolutely. So I started my career in the tech space, like you said. So I was mostly in sales and marketing roles. So I had started as a brand, basically as like a merchandising manager would be the best way to describe it, where I was responsible for various vendors at a tech distributor. And I worked often with, I was the main point of contact for the sales, the salespeople that handled the vendors that I handled. And I handled vendors primarily in like the networking space. So
Right.
networking routers, wireless networks, things like that. And one of the
Out of
vendors,
curiosity, though, because
yeah.
when you're talking about vendors, what kind of things would the vendors be asking for? Because if it's tech, is it everything virtual, or we're talking about vendors like at live events?
So this was kind of back, way back in the day. So basically what I would do is I managed the day-to-day business. So it was kind of like you were a business manager for certain products that you owned as a category.
Oh,
So
okay.
I was responsible for everything from the profit and loss to engaging with my salespeople because we were a distributor and connecting them with, one of the vendors who would be one of the manufacturers I'd be responsible for and connecting them and making sure everything worked. But it gave me a really great foundation of business because I had to deal with everyone from marketing to
Yep,
sales to
exactly.
accounting to finance to
Yeah,
executives and kind of everything in between.
widespread,
And
right?
yeah, and about 20 years ago, I moved out to Austin, which is where I live now. And one of the vendors I had was headquartered here and had a sales position open. So I basically jumped from being a brand manager into a sales role. And the type of sales that I did is not the traditional type of sales because when you're selling to a distributor or a computer reseller, you're not selling to the actual customer. You're
Right.
selling to you're selling to basically a middleman of some sort.
Mhm.
So when you do that, it requires a very different skill set. So you don't have to be as salesy. You have to really be a really good business person to manage that type of thing because you got to be able to understand everybody's challenges and you got to have the emotional intelligence to navigate all of them. Whereas in a traditional, if I was selling a widget to you directly, I
Right.
would only really need to pay attention to you and not all those other dynamics. And I did that for about 10 years and about 5 years into that. So I had been in the industry about 10 years, tech industry about 10 years. I met my now husband who had a very different career and life from me.
Mm-hmm.
And he has run magazines for, the most of his career. And he has a luxury lifestyle publication that is for the whole state of Texas. So it's multiple different cities. So he had asked me very early on in our relationship if I had ever considered writing. So I started writing about events in Austin that I attended and writing about these galas and fundraisers from a guest point of view. And, you know, a lot of business and people have a misperception that galas are really people in fancy clothes doing rich people things, but the
Right.
ones that are really truly successful, there's a lot of business that's transacted at them, you know, and they're raising a lot of money. So a lot of the things that I would go to would raise $1 million in a night. So I got to see how events were successfully done. And the more you know, the longer that I was doing it, and for about 5 years, I was doing basically my tech job during the week and moonlighting, kind of going to these events. And the more
Right.
that I did it, the more difficult and challenging going to tech events was, just because anyone who's in that space and anyone who's ever gone to like a business meal or an industry conference knows a
Yeah.
lot of times those are painful experiences.
Yes.
And
I've been to a few of those. Yeah, I know.
they're not fun. And the more, you know, the more I kind of got into well, I know how a good one's run, and I don't want to go to the bad ones anymore.
Right.
So, you know, to the point where like my last year in the industry, I would, you know, if I had meetings in New York, I'd stay in Philadelphia or Boston that night so I could get out of going to a business dinner. I'd be like, sorry, I got to take the train, you know,
Right.
have fun.
And when those
So
things happen, you got to know it's time to move on. And that's all. I don't want that to get brushed over. Is when you start finding yourself not wanting to be there, and even though it's at that point, you got to start thinking about what's going to be next.
absolutely. And that's, you know, in that last year, it took me about a year to be like, okay, I'm finally done. And I exited the industry, and I've been doing, you know, and going to events full time now for the last, I mean, I've been going to events for 15 years, but it's really been my life for the last decade or so. And I've probably gone to about 2,000 different events over the last 15 years of various types, whether they're event activations, business meals, galas, brand launches, you know, you name it.
But when we're done, and another thing that you actually mentioned that I think it can get overlooked if I don't reemphasize it here, or even gets overlooked nowadays with the power of the internet, is you mentioned that you were a writer. You know, you were writing first. That's kind of what allowed you. And a lot of times, some people don't see writing as a form of communication, when in fact, it very much is a form of communication. Can you kind of speak on a little bit of the lessons and some of the things, and maybe some of the advantages that writing for so long and really focus on being a great writer may have given you, now that you got into how you network and how you communicate and how you put on great events and making sure things are written down first and then you open your mouth?
Absolutely. Well, my job, the way I write is I write as the eyes of the audience at an event. So,
Yes.
not only so I have to write it and communicate it in a way that transports people to that event, and
Yeah.
why it's a good event, and,
Right.
you know, what the people are there to support,
Mm-hmm.
what the people are wearing, what are the highlights of you know, the overall event program,
Yeah.
where was the event, you know, so giving people those basic details, and all those, they may seem very high level and basic, but
Mm-hmm.
putting together a great event it's not rocket science. There's lots of intangibles with it.
Mm-hmm.
But what I learned, you know, back to your part about, you know, the question about communication, is that being an introvert allows me to do my job better as a writer, because I get to
Mm.
take in the information
Yeah.
that everybody is telling me. And I overhear, they
Right.
liked this, they didn't like that, they wish their own, you know, their event had this, they wish that
Right.
company had, you know, that had that.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the communication is listening. And especially if you're an introvert, that's your superpower,
Mm-hmm.
is you can listen. And I always like talking to introverts at events because they're far more interesting,
Right.
because you never really know what they're thinking. So the
Yeah.
conversations with introverts can
Yeah.
go in some really interesting directions.
Right. And I actually venture to say that they're even more valuable because of the logistical work that actually goes on. You know, everybody, I've done a lot of table setups, and I've, you know, been a vendor in several places. A lot of places where people won't speak. You know, if you can't just set up table, you can buy the booth and all that, but you got to go out and meet the people. You got to go out and talk to the people. And introverts have a way of, when you're speaking to people, you are listening. You have to have that ability to listen, but there does come a time where you're going to have to jump out and speak up for yourself. And I'd love for you to share some because you have a lot of it. You have a lot of tips when it comes to like creating events and when it comes to getting the most out of an event so you're not wasting your money and you're speaking and you're connecting with the right specific person. And I'll pass you the mic for a second, but I got to tell this story because I myself and believe it or not is an introvert. At one point I was a very shy, reserved young man and did not do any public speaking at all, but now, obviously I had to change. And one of the things that I remember myself doing was figuring out a question to ask. So I'll give you an example. This was back when I was going to LA Fitness and there was like just got here to West Palm Beach. And there was this guy who would come in like a three-piece. You could tell he had money, man. Like three-piece suit. After the workout, I'm in shorts because I'm in fitness and all that. But he's in a three-piece suit. And I looked at it, I'm like, man, your suit, you have the best suits out, like best suits in this entire place. And then like now I gotta ask you what you do. And then he told me what he did, and then we ended up having a great conversation. And I found out that he was, I believe, an architect, and he could charge so much because of this. But it started out by me noticing the suits that he had on and stuff like that, and that gauged conversation. So when it comes to how you teach it and how you're able to, I guess, talk to people about how to jump out of that comfort zone as an introvert and speak to people so you get the most out of it and you're making the right connection, what sort of things do you tell them to do?
So with introverts, I always like to say an extrovert's doing a cannonball in the deep end. An
Mm-hmm.
ambivert is kind of just jumping into the shallow end, and an introvert's kind of going down step by step, down the steps into the shallow end of the pool. So
Right.
what I really do with introverts is you've got to build, you can't just jump in and do that because it won't feel you and it won't feel authentic.
Mm-hmm.
So really there's two things that I work with people to do. One is scan the room when you enter and look around, is there someone you recognize?
Mm-hmm.
Is there someone who, may be wearing a great three-piece suit like you were talking about that you're
Mm-hmm.
like, you know what, that person's interesting. I'm going to go talk to them.
Right.
And the one that I recommend is if you can't find any of that, the second thing that I always recommend is, and it's a great way to get your sea legs. And I've rarely ever had any long-term relationships form from it, but it's always a great way to get indoctrinated into an event. And that is look at all the bars. Go to the bar that has the longest line.
Mm-hmm.
And that way you can strike up a conversation with the person in front of you or behind you.
Yeah.
The good thing is that it doesn't have to last very long because the line will move and you'll probably talk to them maybe 2 or 3 minutes at the most.
Right. Right.
But you put yourself out there, and most of the time it's real, random chit chat. It's,
Mm-hmm.
real simple questions like, what brought you here today? Because
Right.
everyone always has something in common when they're at an event. It's the association, it's the party host, it's the nonprofit if it's a gala. Whatever that common question is, just ask, how are you involved with X?
Mm-hmm.
Or even more openly, what brought you here today? Because like if you're at a, let's say a holiday office party
Mm-hmm.
and everyone's bringing their spouses, it may be one of the spouses of the employees. So what brought you here today might be better than how are
Mm-hmm.
you tied with this organization. So just kind of get a feeling in doing that and just make sure that the questions are open-ended.
Mm-hmm.
That way you can get as much information as you can. And what I always do is, because people do like to talk about themselves,
Yes.
find the first, and when people give these really long-winded responses, find the first thing that really interested you that they said. That way you're not thinking so hard about what the next thing is. And then that way they can ramble. You can think about your next question. You
Mm-hmm.
can think about it thoughtfully. It's something that interests you, or it's something that you can share an opinion on. And
Mm-hmm.
you're able to bring yourself into the conversation, but you're letting someone else, in a dance, there's always kind of one person always leads in a dance. Let them lead until you're ready to kind of, really
Yes.
take your part in leading it, or take your part in being, a truly active participant. But it is perfectly okay to do that,
Mm-hmm.
just because most people like to talk about themselves. And that is a fact that I have learned
Yeah.
having many, many conversations over the years.
How has and this is probably a great question for you as well, because the technology that's available to us now, whether it is social media or whether it is maybe some like wristband, electrical wristband or whatever. Like I went to a networking event one time and I was connecting with someone, and instead of giving me a card, she pulled out her wrist and she has some promo, and it's like, yeah, if you scan this, then all of a sudden everything's gonna go. And that was kind of weird because it was just awkward. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
when it comes to the technology and the social media and how we communicate now, how, if at all, does the advice change when you're talking to someone that really does want to put their name out there and meet more people and develop a solid network?
So I always say with sharing information, never say, can I get your? Say, can we exchange?
Wow.
Because when I get your,
Mhm.
that means I want something from you. And it feels very one-sided, like you want something out of them, but there's
That's a
no
big one, folks.
return.
I gotta pause you there because that's a big one. I mean, it's such a huge lesson, and it can go over your head when you're having a conversation. So, listeners, I hope you have somewhere where you're taking notes. Don't say, "Can I get yours? Can we exchange?" And he's about to go. I mean, I just have to make sure he make that point. That's a huge, huge gem you just dropped, man.
Absolutely. And when you exchange, they can have the option to do so or
Mhm.
not the option to do so. And
Right.
usually, like what I do is I'll either airdrop it, like because I have an iPhone, so I'll
Mhm.
airdrop my contact information, or I'll, just we'll hand each other our phones and we'll put our information in and we're done.
Right.
So I found technology to be used that way. I tend to be one of those people. I don't like using technology at events. The only time I use it is with the nature of what I do, I have to take photos.
Mhm.
So my phone is really only out for use of my camera.
Right.
And then if I want to exchange contact information, it's out for that purpose. But otherwise, my phone is away. I really, if you're going to be effective at these events, you have to be present. And
Right.
if you've got your phone, if you've got your phone out all the time, you're not present. So
Exactly.
I tend to be very old school with that,
Right.
in that when you show up, showing up means that you're there, you're present, and you show you want to be there. And to me, if I'm scanning the room, I'm not going to walk up to the person who's in their phone because they don't seem like they want to be there. They don't seem interested in what's going on. I'm
Exactly.
going to go to somebody, even if somebody was standing by themselves in a corner and they're
Mhm.
not looking at their phone, they're
Right.
probably an anxious introvert that would love someone to come up and talk to them. I'll
Exactly.
go and talk to them.
Yes.
And because you know, I don't know if any of your viewers follow Oprah, but Oprah's always talked about
Oh,
sexuality
I,
being a
I I can't
yeah.
speak for my. Yeah, I know. I damn sure do. So,
So so she
that's
talked
why I love her, man. Mhm.
I do too. So
Mhm.
she talks about sexuality always as a spectrum. It's
Mhm.
the same way with introversion and extroversion. So even if you think you're an introvert, there's probably someone else in the room who's more introverted than you are. It's
Mhm.
just where you are on that spectrum. So
Right.
if you are feeling more confident, and that's for me, I'll usually try to go now and help someone
Mhm.
who I know is introverted that's just kind of tucked away in the corner.
Right.
That's your way of paying it forward. That you had asked me that question earlier, but that's kind of the journey and the process in
Mhm.
terms of allowing yourself to be more confident. And you can do for somebody else what they did to you. And there is no better way to pay it forward than
Yes.
giving people more confidence, when they're in public places, especially if they're not feeling super comfortable doing so.
Yes. I mean, speaking of Oprah, it was also her who once I've heard her once say that, you know, the world will beat confidence out of you if you really do love what you do and if you really do want to communicate it and it burns in your soul to the point where you have to tell somebody. Eventually the world will beat the confidence out of you because you got to open your mouth and you see something so wrong that you just have to fix it. And that leads me to the next thing I want to make sure that we have that I kind of give you the opportunity to talk about is when you're just starting this, and I know personally how difficult it is to start an event. So when you're talking about event mindset and creating your first event, how were you able to actually get things started and make it so you're getting positive feedback and all that kind of stuff? Walk us through like I guess the first one or some of the trials and tribulations that came with actually starting a company like Event Mindset.
So, when you're known for something, and it's kind of weird because it's very much micro influencer what I do. So, like,
Mhm.
I'm known to a very, 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 very small subset of people.
Mhm.
So I actually started talking with people in that subset to see if it's
Uh,
something that
yes.
would be of interest to them.
Okay.
And most of them it is, just because most of the people I know are very experienced at,
Mhm.
putting on events. They go to things all the time where they've chaired something that's raised $1 million or more,
Nice.
and they see the needs for that. And when you create something, start with where you're kind of most known, especially if you want to stay in that space or kind of put your new spin on something on that space.
Yeah, but that's what I was going to ask you. What was seeing that you kind of had the associates in the industry, what was the creative niche or what was the need that you were filling that wasn't being filled before?
So coming out of COVID, the one thing I noticed was
Oh,
even
man, that
people
was a
who
time,
were,
boy.
it
If we're
was a
talking
time,
events, oh my goodness, that was a time.
but coming out of
And
it,
you were you up north for it?
no, I was here in Texas the whole time.
In Texas, okay, yeah, I'm in
Yeah.
Florida, and I mean, the cruise ships, the events,
Yeah.
it was an absolute tragedy. So, yeah, COVID, man.
And and coming out of that, I just saw people really struggle. Even people who were just amazing at
Hmm.
events. Everyone kind of struggled and lost a step a little bit. And really what I wanted to do was, and I think everyone kind of existentially was like, well, how am I going to be different out of COVID? And for me,
Hmm.
I thought about, well, what do I have that nobody else does?
Right.
I was in client-facing sales roles for 15 years.
Hmm.
And then I became a professional guest. And there's maybe 10 people in the
Ah,
United States who do that.
yeah.
So when you combine them together, I've got this unique story that nobody else has. So for
Mm.
me, positioning wise, it took me a year to figure out what made me unique, even though now I'm like, gosh, it's so obvious.
Right.
So anyone who I would say is starting their own entrepreneurial journey,
Hmm.
list the obvious things, learn from my mistakes. Even though it may be obvious, it may be uniquely you, and no one else may be doing what you're doing. And when you
Hmm.
do that, those opportunities, like I'm amazed at how many opportunities came up because people were like, I've never heard of it before. Like, and that's a question that, or an answer I've gotten many times with what I'm doing is I've never heard of that before. Let's talk about how we can optimize these events so that everybody is having a good time, whether you're going to a business meal, whether you're going to a festival, whether you're going to a nonprofit fundraiser, whether you're going to a company Christmas party.
Hmm. So when it comes to and if they're because most of the like I was telling you before, most of the listeners of the show are business owners. What are specifically the services that you offer to them if they wanted to get involved with what you do when it comes to just whether it's creating their own event, starting from scratch? How are you able to service people specifically?
So I basically have two tracks. So I have a track for host and I have a track for guest because what's
Oh,
expected of a guest and what's expected of a host is they're very different things.
mm-hmm.
Most of the people that I work with on an individual level, I start with the host curriculum unless I know that you know, if they've raised $1 million at a fundraiser, they can bypass that and go directly to the host. But
Okay.
every good host knows how to be a good guest, and every good guest knows how to be a good host. That's kind of my
So
principle is
is there curriculum for hosts and guests?
yes, and they're
Wow. Yeah,
very different.
that's a big need because people go as guests just because it sounds interesting. It sounds interesting, or it's some industry thing, and they really don't know what they're doing there at all. So
Yeah.
the fact that there's a curriculum out there, I hope you guys are paying very close attention and taking advantage of these things because I've been around the block quite a bit. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone say there's a curriculum to be a guest at events. So that's something brand new here.
It is. And the reason that, it's interesting because, any good host that I've ever worked with, the thing is people want to go to their events.
Hmm.
And if you're a good guest, you will be much more likely to be on those lists because the thing that people don't realize about guest lists is they constantly change.
Hmm.
Anytime you go to an event, even if it's the best party each year, it's going to be different each year because you're not going to have the same number of people. People
Right.
get married, people get divorced, people have
Yeah.
have kids. It will never be the same again.
Moving, right.
But the good host know this and they constantly are updating their guest list and they want to make sure that they have the most fun people possible, the most
Mhm.
interesting people possible, people that are really going to make and help elevate their event. So I help individuals primarily, I would say mid-career sales execs looking to,
Mhm.
elevate their career and then executives
Mhm.
on, how do I be better at that? Because the thing is that 70% of CEOs are introverts. So a
Right.
lot of them aren't necessarily naturally comfortable at those
Right.
types of events. So I work with them to kind of map out a strategy that works for them in kind of a custom way. The other thing that I do is I will work with organizations so that they are successfully deploying their employees at events. So, if you've got, someone who's listening who owns a mid-sized company, and maybe they've got 15 salespeople in their company, but
Yeah.
there's conventions, there's business meals, there's all kinds of different things. People will, a lot of leaders that I have worked with, they typically will default, who do you send? And they will always say their most extroverted person. And I'll say, why? And they'll be like, because they're great with people. And I'm like, well, do you really want to send your most extroverted person to a market research conference when your goal at a market research conference is to get intelligence? Because if you think about introverts and extroverts, I think of them and think of any event as Earth. And Earth has the right amount of oxygen. And if you have a room with 100 introverts, there's no oxygen in the room. And there won't be life to your event. If you have 100 extroverts in a room, there's too much oxygen, and everyone knows what happens when there's too much oxygen in a room. Things can explode and get really bad. So if you're going to a market research conference, and we go back to earlier, people love to talk about themselves. An introvert who knows how to answer questions and knows how to engage is going to get way more information about your competitors, about industry trends. They're going to take that information because people aren't coming up to them asking them to tell the same story for the 500th time, and they love doing it. They're going to get you really valuable information, and it's a whole different type of ROI. It's an ROI that allows you as a business to plan for the future. So it's a very different thing. So I work with organizations on not just that, but also, educating and having them go through the workshop curriculums on how to be a good host and a good guest. But that's one tangible way that I really do work with organizations to help them realize you got to look at everybody holistically, and they each bring different things to different events. And once you realize that, you can create a happier team. You have a more confident team. Everyone feels seen. Everyone feels heard. So it creates this confidence that really you can build from within, and it really shows and demonstrates leadership on a leader's part or on an owner's part.
Are there any examples that you may be willing to share, or that you can share, about how it actually changed doing an event with you changed the projection of a company? Because one of the things that I know for a fact is when you do an event, it's an opportunity to connect with a lot of people, and a lot of owners are able to take advantage of it because they're able to get in front of people that they couldn't have gotten in front of if they were to just kind of go about doing business the same old way. And like you had mentioned, the ROI comes in a different form.
So here's what I'll say. I'll give an example where I advised somebody, and it was a little bit more informal. It wasn't formal coaching, but it kind of had the same end result. So this was a organization that had started, and it was a neighborhood organization. And I knew that there was someone very major in our neighborhood who had lots and lots of money that would actively be involved. And they kind of told me their whole story. And I said, why don't you take this person out to dinner and and get to know them and just engage with them. And they got a 7-figure endowment out of it.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, what were they going to do before? They just didn't know how they were going to approach.
They didn't know who to approach. And it was, and part of what I work with is, you look in your networks, and especially, if you're doing something that's kind of a little bit more community based, whether it's nonprofit or you're wanting to start a trade organization or whatever it is, those connections are really, really valuable. So a lot of what I do is we're going to look at your LinkedIn contacts. We're going to look at your Facebook contacts. We're going to look at your email contacts, and we're going to find and map things so that you can really optimize your entire network overall, not just in person, but also in a way you can do it not in person with that as well.
And it's not just a one size fits all, because what you're saying, and again, if you may just be looking at the name of the company, you may think it just may be conferences that you do, but it's not just conferences. It could be a business center. It can be something in which we're just getting people together, like you had mentioned, nonprofits. All of that stuff fits in the kind of the realm in what you do.
Absolutely. And the thing is that So I've been to over 2,000 events, and there's a couple of things I know to be true. One is I've never been to a successful event that didn't have a mix of introverts and extroverts.
Okay.
And then for anyone who is putting on an event, I get this question a lot, and it's probably the one question that drives me crazy. What does it take to make a perfect event? And I tripped over that question for a couple of years before I just said, I've never been to one.
Wow.
And
That's
here's the
over
deal.
2,000 events, guys. He says he's never been to a perfect one.
Well, and here's the deal. If you have a rip roaring time, like I went to something that was, and I'm usually, a pumpkin at 10 p.m. Like I
Yeah.
go, I make my presence known, I go home. And I was at something one time until 12 or 1 in the morning. Rip roaring fun.
Mhm.
And here's the deal though. Everyone would be like on the surface, it's a perfect event. But the thing was, everyone was having so much fun
Mhm.
that cocktail hour went an hour longer than it should have.
I gotta know
So,
where you're
that affects the kitchen.
going. Yeah.
So, so when I say perfect, perfect may be in the eye of the guest, but
Yeah.
there is no such thing as a perfect event because it can be
Yeah.
amazing. There is always something
Mhm.
somewhere that's not that, that's not as it should be. Let's just
Mhm.
say that.
I just actually, speaking of the event I was telling you about earlier, Creators Fest, that happened. That actually happened because apparently it was about creators, and they were supposed to have a guy, Ty Lopez. Yeah, apparently he was supposed to be the feature speaker, and they tried to do it via. He wasn't there, but they tried to do it via Zoom. And when he got up on the Zoom screen, he was actually at another event speaking there. And the founder of the whole event, and this is important. This was in my opinion why I enjoyed the event so much because the founder of the event stopped it, and he goes, "Look, I want to apologize for you guys from the bottom of my heart. I pride myself on making sure things are being said and done the way I said they were going to be done." And he asked us, "Do you want us to keep going, or do you want it to let's just move on to something else?" I appreciate his honesty. He found a follower, like somebody that's going to be loyal for life, because I knew how much he put into it and how much he cared by not just letting it run the way just to say, "Oh, I had Ty Lopez there," but when he realized it just wasn't what he communicated. Okay, communicate that with your guests, communicate that with the people that actually paid the money to be there, and you will develop that loyalty that really trumps everything, and that's
And
what it's all about.
I appreciate you saying that because
Mm-hmm.
the one because when you go to a lot of things, you see a lot of mishaps.
A lot of stuff,
And
yes.
the ones that I remember are if you acknowledge it and move on, I'm not going to remember. I'm not going to remember in 30 days, probably.
Mm-hmm.
If you dwell, I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's important if you're hosting, acknowledge, do not dwell. There's a difference between the two. It's
Wow.
okay to say, you know what, this happened. And like I said, never been to a perfect event. That's going to
Mm-hmm.
happen. And that acknowledgement's really good. Just don't make it a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Don't make it don't amplify it to 5 times bigger than it actually is.
Exactly.
People generally are really forgiving, especially if they're having a good time.
Exactly.
Acknowledge and move on. Do
Mm-hmm.
not dwell.
That's a huge one. Another big gem you just dropped, acknowledging versus dwelling is another thing that I see all the time. And seeing that we are in this social media fueled world, you feel like you can connect with everyone. It can be easy to fall into that dwelling when you just things aren't not going to go according to plan, or when things don't go according to plan. And it's important that you just accept that it's going to happen. So Rob, I do want to be very respectful of your time. I definitely appreciate you coming on. Can you just talk a little bit about what's next for your company, and then how people can get in touch with you if they want to hear more?
Absolutely. So I've got my curriculum and I'm probably going to in 2025 start doing some group coaching programs. So
Mhm.
people can find me at eventmindset.com. I
Mhm.
have free PDF you can download there that's titled 6 Graceful Ways to Exit Any Conversation. So I give 6 kind of common situations and kind of ways that you
Huh.
can get out of those situations. So that's the one thing that is a thing that people ask a lot of. How
Mhm.
do I end a conversation? People don't want to be rude or wasteful of their time. But
Mm.
especially if you're at a business or networking event, your goal is to talk to lots of people.
Yeah.
And some people are like, well, I'm talking to this one person, I don't want to stop. If someone keeps talking, I like to call people who don't stop wind up toys. It's okay to put your hand on the buzzer for a second to make them stop and just be
Yeah.
like, you know, I've really enjoyed talking to you, but I need to refresh my drink, or just something very
Yeah,
simple like
yeah,
that that allows everyone to kind of go on with their evening. So
yeah.
that, and then you can find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook at Rob Giardinelli.
Yeah, and doing that when you are in that situation, you have to be somewhat delicate with it because you don't want to ruin the contact. But going into every conversation knowing what you want, that just goes back to the work that you're doing previously before you even get to the event, and that speaks to your curriculum. And I'm excited to hear more about this group coaching program. Events. I'm in South Florida, man, so events are huge out here. So
I know they are, and no one knows how to throw a party quite like South Florida
right,
does.
that's Florida, man. So the final thing I do, Rob, with all the shows, the way I close it all out is I want you to use your imagination a little bit. You are the tech version of Rob. You are kind of struggling. I don't want to say struggling, but you're just not feeling the adventure. You're seeing things that aren't attractive to you, and you kind of want more. Pretend that that version of Rob has come into the Zoom room. Give him some words of encouragement, and we will officially close.
So my encouragement to you is when you're invited to something, set goals, set three basic goals. Make sure one of them, I have three tenets. One is joy. Give yourself a break and allow yourself something that allows you to just feel full and energized. Then
Mhm.
there's confidence. Do something that stretches yourself out of your comfort zone. And then third is purpose, because you're there to network or you're there to get a contact. So do one goal of each. And even if you don't meet all three, do the joy one first. Because if you have joy, you're going to look like you want to be there. And when you look like you want to be there, other people will come up to you. So, that's what I would tell Tech Rob is start with joy. I know it's a work event,
Right.
but if you go to something every year at your industry conference and they have a great signature cocktail that's gone after 45 minutes, get there on time and get that cocktail. And
Yep.
then that way you've got your joy goal done,
Yep.
you're happy, and you'll be able to have a good time the rest of the time you're there.
Man, that's some strong advice. Just start with joy. Make sure you're having and fun and you figuring out what is going to be joyful for you. So going in, you're able to manage these things. So fella, all again, like I said, teammates, you listeners, regular listeners, your first time listening, just get used to it. This is what we're all about here. To my regular listeners, you already know this is what we do every single day, new episodes daily. We do not stop. There's no plans at all of stopping the show at all. So all that being said, fellow teammates, continue to move swiftly. We will talk more soon.